Greetings, digital world. Welcome back once again to another episode of Spliced In Later, over the 200 episode mark. How wonderful. My podcast host sent me a letter that said, "Oh, you've hit 200 episodes. Congratulations. Here's your prize. Us allowing you to host your podcast here. You should celebrate." We're not going to. Well, I didn't either, except that I watched Creed, and honestly, that was a good way to celebrate 200 episodes. I'm still coming off the high of Creed 3. That was a really good movie, and it gets better the more I think about it. But we're in a bit of a lull this week. There are a lot of movies coming out in March, but nothing that I plan on seeing this week. Next week, we've got some good stuff. I'm going to a very early screening of Dungeons & Dragons. The new Shazam movie's coming out. Later in the month, John Wick. To bring in April is the Mario movie, which everyone's very interested to see how that turns out. Hell, even Peter Pan and Wendy on Disney Plus. Might be terrible, but it'll be something I watch. I will not be seeing Scream 6 this week, which is the big movie that comes out this week. Not because I don't like the Scream franchise. I actually don't mind it. I think of all the horror franchises that are out there, the Scream ones I can roll with a bit more because they are very tongue-in-cheek, self-aware, all of that stuff. The problem is I haven't seen the last Screams. I didn't see Scream 5, or Scream as it's called. And I don't want to see Scream 6 without having seen it. And also I don't think I can see the Scream films in the cinemas anyway, because jump scares. I prefer to watch them on my own terms, on a nice sunny Sunday afternoon with the lights on and the windows open, where I feel safe and secure. So we'll see. Maybe one day I'll give you a Scream 6 review. It won't be anytime soon. This week we're going to just do a regular episode. Just look for the archives of Spliced In Later's DVDs and Blast from the Past and all of that stuff. And for this week, it's going to be a bit of a messy one because I sort of do want to talk about it and I don't want to talk about it, but it's something that should come up because it's worth addressing. If you've been listening to this show for a long time, you know that I kind of have a rocky history when it comes to Star Wars, specifically the recent Star Wars stuff and the Star Wars fandom as a whole. We've touched on it in many different episodes in different varieties. Back when I first launched this show, when I was just starting out, I was putting out reviews and analysis of old movies. Generally, people were very nice and pleasant, all of that stuff. Rise of Skywalker was coming out at the end of that year, 2019. As we all know, The Last Jedi had been a tumultuous affair, Episode 8, when that came out in 2017. So before Rise of Skywalker came out, I did do an analysis on that. To be honest, I don't mind The Last Jedi, but I was sort of understood what the problem with it was and all of that. But the response I got to that was probably the most negative I had ever got on a show like this before. I know it's YouTube's, I know it's the social medias, you are going to get that stuff, but it shouldn't have come to surprise, but talking about Star Wars would invoke that sort of reaction. And then the same thing happened when I reviewed Rise of Skywalker, as I really didn't enjoy that film at all, and the direction that the sequel trilogy had gone, or the lack of leadership, or the lack of direction, or anything like that trilogy went through under their new involvement with Disney. And that got a lot of hate too. Since then, I've stayed away from talking about Star Wars. I really don't like to. I've touched on the Star Wars TV shows that have come out on Disney Plus because I sort of set a precedent when I talked about The Mandalorian, which I didn't mind. I thought was quite good. So we've talked about things like the Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Andor. The new Mandalorian has started as of last week. And it's that coming out which prompted me to do this episode because I watched the first episode of The Mandalorian. I thought it was fine. I wasn't particularly impressed. It's a whole other episode to unpack how The Mandalorian sort of hijacked the Book of Boba Fett, turned that show into its own show. And then if you didn't know that and you were watching season 3 of The Mandalorian, you'd feel like you've missed a whole chunk of story because you did. People were asking me about what I thought and I was giving them my opinion. And then the response to that was, well, yeah, I mean, that's to be expected because you hate Star Wars. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I don't want to put that out there about me. So this is sort of a attempt to rectify that approach, that opinion of my opinion of Star Wars. Because once upon a time, Star Wars was my most favoritist thing of all time. It was the thing I loved the most, more than superhero movies, more than Harry Potter, more than Doctor Who, Power Rangers, bloody Fireman Sam. All through my life, Star Wars, as I was growing up, was the thing. It was my thing. And I still really like Star Wars as a franchise, as a story, a very specific story. Things about Star Wars very much I like. And I do like what it used to be. I'm just not a fan of what it has become. And that's not really Star Wars' fault itself. It's the fault of all the fingers on the trigger of the Star Wars franchise. Too many cooks is the term I would use. Ever since George Lucas let go of his beloved franchise and let other people have a stab at it, everybody's been allowed to take it in their own direction and to varying degrees of results. Say what you will about George Lucas as a director and how silly you think the prequel movies are, whatever you believe of all that, he at least had a vision that he stuck to. As bizarre as it was, it all sort of felt consistent. Anyway, so for this episode, I just kind of want to let people know that I did like Star Wars and I do like Star Wars. After this, I think I'm done talking about it on this show completely, though, because it makes me both happy and sad to talk about it, because for a long time, Star Wars was the thing for me. When I was a kid, we had one of those Trivial Pursuit games, and back when I was a kid, all the rage were board games attached to DVDs, DVD games. So you've probably seen some people play them on YouTube. I think like Camp Rock's got their own one or something like that, where you get a board game, but there's a DVD that's attached to it, and you play along with the board game as the DVD asks you questions or show you clips or gives you instructions. I had the Star Wars, at the time, complete saga, before there was an episode 7, 8, and 9, Trivial Pursuit, where the DVD would flash through different planets, different questions, different types of questions. Very fancy, fancy for 2005. And I loved that game because I loved Star Wars so much and I knew so much about Star Wars. When I played it with my family, which was often because I forced them to, we'd always have to play everybody against me. And we had to have handicaps on me so that I wouldn't just hog the game and answer all the questions and the game would be over. So basically there'd be like 5 against me. I could answer the questions up until I got a piece of cheese for my wheel. And then I had to forfeit that turn. I had to let someone else go. Which only delayed the inevitable. But at least some people got to have a turn. You go back through my old books as a kid. I got tons and tons of Star Wars books. I used to write Star Wars fan fiction because I was that nerdy. I've got Star Wars on both VHS and DVD. Every way of owning those original films, I had them. Unfortunately, I don't have the original stuff before George Lucas messed with them. But I've seen enough of it on the interwebs to pretty much know the ins and outs, every detail. And I also really loved Star Wars when it was brought up under Disney and started coming out. I really liked The Force Awakens. And, I didn't mind Rogue One either. The problem that I had with Star Wars, as we've addressed many, many times, is just the direction it took, the lack of planning to create a trilogy, Disney's incessant goal of just making as much money out of this newly acquired thing as they possibly could by pumping out as much content as they possibly could. The MCU is getting dangerously close to doing the same thing. To a point where if someone says we want to turn our franchise into a franchise like Star Wars, that makes me genuinely concerned. I saw that recently with Warner Brothers, New Line Cinema, I don't know who it was, but they said they want to turn The Lord of the Rings into a franchise rivaling Star Wars. That makes me feel ill. I don't want that. The Lord of the Rings is a solid trilogy of movies, and I don't mind the Hobbit films either. But what's the go there? You're going to have tons of different spin-offs and TV shows, 2 Lord of the Rings films every year. No, don't do it. Don't do it. So that's bad. If something says, I want to be like Star Wars and I'm concerned, there's a problem there. But back in the day, Star Wars was the jam. And I still love my Star Wars. I guess I'm a grumpy old man who just likes his own stuff and doesn't want to play with the new stuff, and that could be right. So let me see. When I got into Star Wars, I guess I titled this episode as it was going to be an analysis of the original Star Wars, but I think it's going to be just an analysis of the franchise back when it was under George Lucasfilm. So that's the original trilogy and the prequel films, and to an extent, TV show, animated shows, books, things like of that nature. But basically before Disney bought Star Wars. So when I first got into Star Wars, the very first episode I watched was The Phantom Menace. Didn't watch it in the theaters. I was at my father's house and it was on. And say what you will about The Phantom Menace, say what you will about the prequels, I'm not going to get into that. But as a 10-year-old kid, it was probably one of the coolest movies I'd ever seen because of the lightsabers and the star battles and the battle droids and magic force awakening powers, pod racing, talking creatures. Thought it was cool, and the music from John Williams as well. Loved it. So then you learn, oh yeah, there are more Star Wars films. You sort of go, they seem a bit different. And that's when, as a kid, you have to be explained to, they came out quite a few years before this one. They're actually set after The Phantom Menace. Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker are the same person. You will never know what it's like to discover that naturally. And I can't get people to discover that naturally because I've recommended Star Wars to a few people at work. And they always go away and they come back and they go, I watched the first one. I can't really get into it. I don't really feel like watching the next one. It's like, just watch Empire Strikes Back. Just get to that point. If you don't know, it'll be cool. I want to see what happens if you experience it. I don't think we'll ever get there. So checked out those original films, and it was the same vibe. It was the same feel, even though they were older. Obviously felt a bit more dated, a bit slower in the lightsaber fights, a bit more 80s style, late 70s. The overall arching story of Jedi versus Sith, Rebels versus the Empire, good versus evil, space battles, battles on ice planets and forest planets, Death Stars, bounty hunters, stormtroopers, swampers, all of that stuff. It was a really fun, engrossing, engaging world that had a story that was sort of already told. By having the original trilogy first being like the end of Darth Vader's story, you sort of got that satisfaction of knowing how things would turn out. And then the prequels obviously went and filled in the gaps for you there. That original Star Wars on its own, before it became a franchise, before it became this big thing, it's a miracle it came out. I highly recommend, if you never watched Star Wars, you should at least watch the Star Wars documentary. There's several. I can't tell you exactly which one to watch because I don't know their names, but all the documentaries are the same. They tell the same information because history is the same. But basically, George Lucas, he was a relatively known director back in the days, but no one wanted to touch this idea, this thing he was going around and telling people about, this war in the stars with Luke Starkiller and all these other things. People were just like, nope, not taking a chance on it, especially when other sort of sci-fi things weren't particularly successful of that time. Don't ask me why. I don't know if people just weren't ready for it or if the right stories hadn't been told. But it got to a point when Star Wars was finally made, it was basically George Lucas almost had a mental breakdown. He was stretched to the very limit to make this movie. People like Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill didn't think it would be very successful at all. Alec Guinness was like, I'll do this. It's fine. Stretch my acting chops a bit to play a man in space, I suppose. To a point where if the movie was going to make any money, George Lucas was going to get pretty much the entire profits. And lo and behold, that's how he became one of the most wealthiest men in the whole world. People often say to me, I don't want to watch Star Wars because I don't like science fiction. I don't like space. I don't like mystical, magical mumbo jumbo. But then they tell me, but I really like fantasy. Fantasy is good. I like things like witches and wizards and dystopian futures where kids have to kill each other for survival. It's the same thing. It really is. Science fiction is just fantasy in space. I guess if you want to be technical and be a nerd about it, science fiction is sort of based in reality, but not really. Don't fool yourselves. Science fiction is just a fancy way of saying fantasy in space. The stories that they tell in things that like involving Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or anything like that, Star Wars is the exact same stuff. It's just not on Earth. It's in space. And I don't know why that's such a distinction that people have between those things. Casting all that aside, though, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, just Star Wars if you want to be technical, is legitimately a perfect story. It is simple, it is easy, it is the epitome of good versus evil storytelling. The young hero, the chosen one, who's thrust into an adventure he's not ready for, with wacky sidekicks, including a guy who seems like he'll betray everybody but really has a heart of gold, a walking carpet, 2 wacky droids, a wise old mentor, a princess that needs saving. It's Mario in space, if there you go. Up against a very evil person clad in black that's just unstoppable and just kills people without reason, and his evil organization with their super weapon which can go around and blow up entire planets, and all the young heroes have to band together against an overwhelming enemy to just try and score a single victory and restore hope to the galaxy. You throw in stuff like that along with lightsabers, starships, droids, stormtroopers, all these things, these very cool, distinct things that make Star Wars a unique thing, but then recognizing as well that a lot of the influence you see in here come from things like the Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai, the classic hero's journey story that you get in a lot of old-time films. When I go through my 1001 films to watch before you die, so many entries are like, a lot of what you see here would have went on to inspire Star Wars. So there you go. Incredible music from John Williams as well. If you love John Williams' music from Harry Potter and Indiana, Indiana Jones, Jaws, E.T., his most effective musical pieces is from Star Wars. Some people could argue with me about that, but I believe that to be the case. John Williams and Star Wars, hand in hand. It's the most iconic sounding franchise orchestra that you'll ever hear. And each movie adds its own little distinct music to add to the ever-growing library of music that he just gets better and better until he stopped with the sequel trilogy, when I guess he was just sort of like, here's my music, you know what to do with it. But man, when he was bringing in the stuff like Duel of the Fates and Battle of the Heroes for the prequel trilogy, great stuff. Star Wars, solid film, blew people's minds. Of course, people are like, come back and do a sequel if you can. I don't know the history of George Lucas coming up with Star Wars. It changes depending on the interview you watch, but I do believe like he had a set story he wanted to tell, and then it got twisted as he tried to look at the different ways he could tell the story. Which is why The Empire Strikes Back, the follow-up to Star Wars, is so good. In fact, some people argue it's even better than Star Wars. It really, it's the infamous Rocky and Rocky 2 issue. The movie you like more depends on what you're in the mood for. If you want the triumphant, heroic, good versus evil film, you like Star Wars. If you want to see a hero's push to the limit and darkness and tragedy and some real despair, you watch The Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back raised the game for everybody involved in Star Wars. The stakes were higher. Even more lore was added, more planets, more mysticism. The lightsaber fights upped even more. Evil emperors get introduced. And obviously the infamous twist involving Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker is in there too. And then wrapping it all off, Return of the Jedi. Some people say it's the weakest of the trilogy. I personally think all 3 films are perfect together. On their own, they're also great, but they tell a very cohesive story. Even if you don't have the whole, how does Anakin become Darth Vader, you're set with just these 3 films. And Return of the Jedi has an extremely satisfying ending, a very action-packed climax, which ended the story. And for most people, that's as far as they want to go. For me, the prequels ring true to me more because I grew up with them. So 1999, 2002, and 2005 was when episodes 1, 2, and 3 come out. Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith. Which means once I'd watched Phantom Menace and I was fully into Star Wars, I could very excitedly look forward to each film and see Attack of the Clones as soon as it comes out. Revenge of the Sith, if I remember correctly, my mother came and pulled me out of school and said that I was having a diabetes issue. And instead we just went and watched Revenge of the Sith. And I do believe that it was like a Great Escape chicken run style of thing, because I'm pretty sure I convinced her to also pull out of school 3 of my friends. The naysayers, it's all on your preference. People who really like the original trilogy looked at the prequels and were like, what's going on? And I can understand that. The prequels were when George Lucas, he directed them all himself. He was completely let loose to do whatever he wants. And I think, as is the case with a lot of people, I think of Ridley Scott, for example, with something like Blade Runner, they don't really know what it was about the thing they've created that made it so appealing, so successful, and end up focusing on the wrong things and get carried away in their own thing. So George Lucas was suddenly focusing more on politics in Star Wars and trade disputes and strange dialogue, which no one was there to tell him. Well, people were there, but nobody said, George, people don't talk like that. People don't say how much they hate sand. That's a weird thing. Don't put that in there. I mean, Mark Hamill said about those original scripts for the original trilogy, there was some weird shit that he was having them say in there that they cut out. But there you go. Sure, they're probably inferior to the original trilogy in terms of quality. For me, though, I really like them because they're a part of my childhood. And I think they tell the cohesive story of how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader. Say what you will about Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, they probably aren't particularly well made, but they've got some really cool visuals, some really cool battles, some epic music. Ewan McGregor is a complete wonder. They lucked out when they pulled him to play Obi-Wan Kenobi. Revenge of the Sith, I think, is actually quite the treat. I think people lump it in with the other two, but when you analyze it, it's a very, very bleak, very dour film, obviously, for what it has to do, which is tell the fall of the Jedi, Anakin turning to the dark side, the Empire taking over, everything that makes the whole galaxy as shit as it is by the time A New Hope starts. But the balance between starting off with a lighthearted humor and then going full downhill into despair and utter bleakness, that final struggle between Obi-Wan and Anakin, seeing former best friends fight to the death, hating each other now at this point, the clones turning on the Jedi, it's really cool stuff. Revenge of the Sith is one of my favorite Star Wars films by far. And then all the lore around it, whether you watch the Clone Wars TV show, either the first one or the second one, or you read all the books read by Judd Stewart, Justin Nelson, I don't know. There was one guy who pretty much wrote every Star Wars book. He wrote like Jedi Apprentice, which was Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's adventures, Jedi Quest, which is Obi-Wan and Anakin's adventures, Last of the Jedi, which is some more adventures. Through it all, through all this stuff, it all felt consistently the same thing. It felt like it was all part of the same world and was all attributing to the ever-expanding lore. And I analyzed this stuff so much that obviously I could play the trivia games and make it not fun for anybody. Here we are now in 2023. We have got our Disney sequel trilogy. We had Disney's experimentation with the Star Wars stories. We had Rogue One and Solo. The Disney Plus shows, The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Andor, animated anime, all of that. There's plenty of Star Wars in varying degrees of consistency or tone. To be fair, I don't hate a lot of the stuff around the sequel trilogy. I just don't like the sequel trilogy because nobody took the time to plan out a story for that. Episodes 1 to 6 tell the rise and fall of Darth Vader. Episode 7 told the story J.J. Abrams wanted to tell up until he decided not to anymore. Then Rian Johnson told a story he wanted to tell right up until he didn't want to anymore. And then Colin Trevorrow wasn't allowed to play, and then J.J. Abrams had to come back and try and wrap up a inconsistent, all over the place story that no one really knew at any point what was going on, which leaves a bad taste in your mouth. The problem with Star Wars for me is that I can't get excited about it anymore, and I worry about the MCU. I worry that the MCU will do the same thing with the constant stuff, the constant movies, the constant TV shows. It's become more about quantity over quality, and that is what Star Wars was the first to show. What happens when a power like Disney gets a hold of a beloved franchise and just blows their load before they even have a chance to really think about what they've got. Combined to that with the rise of social media and how you can hear what everybody's saying all the time constantly, and everyone's always mad at each other, and very specifically in the Star Wars fandom do people seem to be so mad at each other. Either they love these films so much, they love specific films that they love and they hate the rest and they get mad at each other for it, or they get aggressive about how they've been let down, or aggressive if other people are feeling let down because they shouldn't feel let down. But then Star Wars Celebration comes around and everybody packs into these auditoriums like a cult, like a political rally, and they play a 10-second teaser of where you can hear Darth Vader's breathing and people cry. And you're just like, we're just going round and round in circles here. So even when you come out with consistently good shows like Andor, it's tainted to me, unfortunately. And it's tainted so much that it reverberates back to my old love of Star Wars, to a point where I feel like I can't talk about how much I did like Star Wars, because either it leads to this new stuff where I feel bad, or you get called a hypocrite because like, oh, you like that Star Wars but you don't like this Star Wars, just shut up and go away. Which probably will happen when people listen to this. If genuine Star Wars fans have been like, oh, someone's talking about Star Wars, I'm going to listen to this, and they just hear, well, first they hear nonsense, because that's all I do is just talk nonsense. So they really shouldn't care what I'm saying, because even I don't really know what I'm saying. But of all the things I do, this is always the stuff I post where I'm like, even if I say really positive stuff about Star Wars, this is the thing where I could get some really nasty negative feedback. The very few times I've got emails in my Gmail account linked to this thing have been about Star Wars things, and they've been like, fuck off and die. So we'll have to wait and see. But the point of this whole thing was, I don't hate Star Wars, and I don't want people to naturally assume that if I don't like a new Star Wars thing that comes out, it's because I just don't like Star Wars. I really love Star Wars episodes 4 to 6 and 1 to 3. I really like a Clone Wars. I really like all the animated stuff that's been going on since before Disney took over, that has spewed into one another. Well, not spewed, rolled in, I should say. So Clone Wars, Rebels, Bad Batch, that sort of stuff as well. I don't mind Andor. I don't mind The Mandalorian. I don't mind Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's not that I'm not willing to enjoy this stuff when it comes out. It's just a little, you take it with a grain of salt, and you're just a little cautious. And it's a cautionary tale for any other franchise out there. If you want to be the next Star Wars franchise, consider what that means. Do you want to be a beloved franchise that made consistently good stuff for a long time? Or do you want to be that franchise that just makes 20 different products to sell to consumer because the computer analyzation has categorized all forms of content that audience will embrace, and less about actually telling stories that people want to tell? Who knows? We'll have to see. Time will tell. I would like to leave everybody who's listened up to this point though, and if you haven't seen Star Wars, check it out. I really do love that original Star Wars. I really love that original trilogy. It's very good movies. If you've never given it a chance, give it a chance. If you gave it a chance once and it didn't ring true for you, that's okay. Maybe go back and have another look though. Or you can just leave it alone. But I do like that stuff. Getting ready for this episode, I did rewatch all the old Star Wars stuff, and it still rings true to me, and it still reminds me that from about 10 to 17, I lived, breathed Star Wars, and I wish I still did. Maybe one day again, which would be nice. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. As I said, next week launches quite a few movie reviews in a row. We'll be doing 2 next week with Dungeons and Dragons and Shazam. A week after that, John Wick. Later on, Mario, all those other things. So be sure to tune in for that stuff, because I'm excited to talk to you about that stuff. Hopefully Creed 3 will start off a nice roller coaster of just consistently good films. It's unlikely, but here's hoping. Until then, I love and appreciate you as always. Thank you for listening to me and bearing with me. And give Star Wars a go. Just not... man, Star Wars is so confusing. I honestly don't know how I feel. Anyway, Until the next time, everybody, you've been spliced in later. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.